Morning, brethren, friends. Good to see everybody. Glad that you're here. And so many good-looking folks in the audience today. All you mothers out there, we're glad you're here. Happy Mother's Day. We have a special visitor with us this morning, Kayla Huey. She is from Mississippi. She's really from Memphis, but anyway, she's right across the line there in Olive Branch. So we're glad to have her. She's visiting my son, and I don't even know what I'm supposed to say. Do you even say what? Girlfriend. You can say that? Okay. I know nowadays, going out, all that stuff. I remember our kids were coming home saying, well, me and him or her and me, we're going out. I'm like, you're 10. You're not going anywhere. But that was the terminology. So I try to keep up with it, but it doesn't do me any good. So I'll leave that alone before I get in any more trouble. But it is good to see you guys. Glad you're here. And we just happen to be in a study of one word. And this word, of course, this week is going to be number 43, which is guilt word. And it's in the Life Challenges section. And, of course, we said there's worry, suffering, shame. And so the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at guilt and grief. Guilt it's like carrying around a bag of rocks in a backpack. You don't need it. And so guilt is what a preacher would probably feel if he spent all Sunday morning, Mother's Day, talking about some word like guilt, because all the women would give him a really hard time. So we're going to skip that, and we're going to talk about Mother's Day. And so many of you here that are mothers, I can just tell you from experience, I appreciate being here. And so I wouldn't be here if it were not for my mother. And so all you mothers out there, this is a day, very thankful that our country, we have a holiday like this. It hadn't been around forever. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the lesson. But you mothers, bear in mind, you are an endangered species. That's right. Motherhood in our country today is not looked at as it was 50 years ago. As a matter of fact, it is attacked. Absolutely amazing that you could find mothers being looked down upon, being attacked, saying that they're oppressing their gender, that they're doing more to hurt mankind and civilization by behaving as such than they would if they did not. Imagine that. What would you do if you went a generation without mothers? Well, I tell you what you'd do. You would no longer do anything. It'd be over. Brother Claiborne several years ago wrote an article in which he talked about the two most important women in his life. The two most influential people in his life was his mother and his wife. She was a great influence to him. This all started about 50 years ago, 48 years ago. In 1970, a lady by the name of Shulamith Firestone wrote a book. And in it, she kind of laid the framework. And you're saying, Ronnie, that's 50 years ago. Why are you even bothering bringing that up? Because I want to show you she's a prophet. She not only, and I mean that in a sense of she tells us what the future is going to be because people bit into it. And they started teaching in the schools 50 years ago, a little bit at a time. Because what I'm going to say is so ridiculous. 50 years ago, she'd have been run out of town on a pole. But people bought into it a little bit at a time, and they started feeding it to us. And now I want you to hear some of the things that she has to say. She's, of course, what we would call is a women's lib. We don't have that anymore. You have the feminist movement. It's just changed names. It's the same thing. And there's a couple of things she'd like to see happen. Number one, she says women should be freed from their childbearing and child-rearing roles by equally distributing those roles throughout society. Now listen to what she's saying. Ladies, if you have a child, you shouldn't be responsible for raising it. The community should be responsible. The society should be responsible. Have you ever heard the mantra, it takes a village? That's the seed. That's where it was planted. Folks, it doesn't take a village. It takes a mama and it takes a daddy being a man, a woman, being a mother and a father. That's how God intended it to be, and that's what works. This village thing isn't working out very well for us. If you don't believe me, go down to the Hamilton County Jail. Go from there, go to Silverdale, the county workhouse. And if you're not convinced by then, go to the Bledsoe County State Penitentiary. and see how the it takes a village is working out for us. It's not working for us. But that's what she said 50 years ago. She said it takes a village, but she didn't say that. She says basically that the government should step in. Such an arrangement would require that federal government establish and operate nationwide daycare centers. Number two, she says women must be completely free to choose what they will do and how they will finance it. And doing that just may not allow for bearing children. Whether their husband wants it or not, she shouldn't have to do that. Says, of course, in order to do that, the right of abortion on demand would be a critical part of that arrangement. Has that not taken place? As a matter of fact, this was just written 3 years before Roe versus Wade. Of course it's taken place. And it's taken place to the point now where it's almost like going through a drive-in restaurant. She frankly admits that her proposal would utterly destroy the home as we know it. She doesn't have a problem with that. She considers marriage and motherhood as women's greatest enemy. Imagine that. Number three, she says, Firestone, she says, demands that women and children be integrated in all phases of society. Any organization which would segregate the sexes or prevent children from any phase of adult society must be eradicated, and that, of course, would include school. You might say, well, what does that look like? Did y'all hear the news? I guess it was last week, the week before last. The Boy Scouts of America is changing their name. They're not going to be so, segregated as to call themselves the Boy Scouts. Well, when I was growing up, we had Boy Scouts and we had Girl Scouts. And, everybody kind of figured out which one they needed to be in. We also knew what bathroom to go to. But, it takes this kind of psychology. It takes this kind of education to get so foolish that you don't know the difference between a boy and a girl anymore. That's what Romans 1 says all it says about. Basically, that's the bottom line. We've gotten to a point where when they knew God, they chose him not to know God, and they worshiped themselves. They worshiped the creature more than the Creator. Number four, she says, women and children must be completely free to choose the ways in which they express their sexuality. In other words, you shouldn't tell a little girl she's a little girl. You shouldn't tell a little boy he ought to be a little boy. You ought to let them choose. Folks, that was written 50 years ago. What is it? Seed. It's seed. Has it grown? Oh, you better believe it's grown. She goes on to say that all human beings, young, old, male, and female, be allowed to indulge in every form of sexual behavior. That's talking about children as well. Every form of sexual behavior. Folks, that's just sexual deviance. And that's what she's saying. But you look around, is that what's being promoted today? Is that what's being pushed? Folks, for a man to stand up and say a husband ought to marry a wife, a man ought to marry a female, folks, we're being told that's a hate crime, that you're being ugly, that you're being judgmental. Folks, that's being godly. And don't let anybody tell you any differently. And years ago, we understood that. Well, does Firestone 50 years ago, did she represent the majority of society? I do not think she did at all. But she planted some seeds. What about today? Does the majority of the American people believe this? I don't think so. But then again, I haven't went around America and taken a poll. I haven't went to California or New York. I'm just talking about the people I know. But we've still got a pretty good idea of who's a girl and who's a boy. That a mommy ought to be a woman and a daddy ought to be a dad. A father, a man, ought to be a father. So that's where we are. Another feminist, around the same time, named Betty Friedan, said that women living in the suburbs was like a comfortable concentration camp. She says for women to stay home and raise the children and be a housewife is a slow death of mind and spirit. Folks, you look at these kind of attacks, and it's no wonder that we have the problems we do. She wrote this book, and 25 years later, she had to come out and write another book. She called it The Second Stage, because a lot of women were saying, look, I went on. I became a film star, or I became lawyers and things of this nature, medical doctors, but they didn't have a family. And you know what the number one problem was? They were lonely. They said, I've achieved this, but outside of these women live movement, I don't have anything. I'm lonely. Does that surprise the Christian at all? No. We go back to the beginning. We look at God creating Adam and looking at that and say, man, creation is great. This is wonderful. But one thing was lacking. It is not good that man should be alone. And hence the woman was created for man. Companionship. The man for the woman for the man. Together to form the family. That would eliminate loneliness. Well, in our lives, think about this. Just how important is mothering? Can you think of anything as important? You don't have to have a psychoanalyst, a psychologist, a sociologist with a lot of initials behind their name to tell you what you already know. Being a mama is real important. And for us children, those growing up with a mama, we're pretty good. You know, we're thankful for that. A lady, a psychoanalyst from the Department of Psychiatry, there we go, University of Michigan, wrote a book called In Defense of Mothering, where she comes out and says, you know, our grandmothers would be proud that we finally figured out you need a mama. You need a mama. Children deserve to have a mother. It's an important part of their development. They need that. There's a fellow wrote a Reader's Digest, came out with an article called Love and Marriage, and he was talking about the awesome power of love. And in Dusseldorf, Germany, a Dr. Fritz Talbot was visiting a hospital, and he noticed this really large lady walking around with a child. He just asked, who's that lady there? They said, oh, that's Anna. And he was like, well, you know, what's her role here? And her role was, when the medical people had done all they could for a child and the child just wouldn't get any better, they would turn the child over to Anna. You know what she would do? Carry it around. Carry it around, oogle with it, talk to him, her, love on him, and they would see improvement in the children. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot to understand that. I just happen to have a little bit of insight in that my wife does this for a living. And a lot of times those little babies, and they learn, especially the ones that have been there a while. You know, when they're really, really sick and stuff, they don't want to be touched a whole lot. But the ones that get older, they'll cry. And you know what they want? You know, a lot of times she says, you know, I had this one last night, and he was just giving me a fit, and I went over there to him, and when I'd touch him, he'd just look up and smile. You know, I mean, that's what children want. It's what they need. There was a fella, a king, a doctor, you know, most of us know James Dobson. He's great as far as raising family stuff. If you ever go to a bookstore, he's got a whole shelf just his, you know, everything from how you treat your male children to husband-wife relationships. He's very much into that. He's a psychologist. But he talks about a Prussian king. I looked this fella up. He's middle of the 19th century. He was convinced that if you took children, you just isolated them. You didn't talk to them. You didn't have anything to do with them. I don't know where he got this. But if you did that, they would naturally start speaking Hebrew. That's what he thought. He thought if you didn't touch them, you know, that Hebrew must be in our DNA because that was the, you know, the language of the Israelites. So they tried that. And they had 50 children. And, you know, the people that were raising them, the foster parents, foster mothers, were not allowed to speak or interact with the child. And do you know how many of them spoke Hebrew? Do you know how many of them spoke any language? No, they not only didn't speak Hebrew, they didn't speak any language. You know why? They died. All 50 of those children died for something me and you would know that's the case. Think about our nation right now and the way that motherhood, the way that marriage, the way that motherhood is viewed, and what does it look like for the future of our country? Now, I'm going to tell you what, there are elements of our society, they look at what we're doing as an educated, middle-class society, and they're laughing their heads off. You know why? They don't believe that. Their mom and dad, their mom's the greatest thing since cotton candy, and they'll have 12, 15 kids in a family, no nothing problem. That's the way they do it. That's the way they roll. Look at your Muslim families. They'll have 3 or 4 wives, and they'll have children. They have this many children. They understand how important it is to have children. They get the idea that that's the husband and wife relationship. The man and the woman, they have children. It's a natural thing. And yet you can get so educated and so smart like we are and figure out, well, you know, mothering's a bad thing. Folks, we know better than that. And why we even put up with such, I have no idea. There was a fellow by the name of Harold Voth. He was a senior psychiatrist and psychoanalyst for the Menninger Foundation, which began, I think, up north, but it moved down to the Baylor School of Medicine. In a speech he wrote, and this was reported in the Alabama Journal of Medical Science, he said, and who wouldn't agree with this, mothering is probably the most important function on earth. Think about that. Mothering is probably the most important function on earth. You know what? I totally concur with that. I believe that is absolutely right, because it is the point where the groundwork is set. In the book of Ecclesiastes, a lady by the name of Jane McWhorter wrote an article that I gleaned some things from. Don McWhorter's wife, Jane, wrote a lot of books. One of them was the first book I ever got dealing with grief. It was called Let This Cup Pass, and it was dealing with grief. And boy, I learned with that book to really appreciate her insight. Anyway, Jane talks about being a mother. She said, boy, wouldn't it just be great if being a mother was like making a cake? You know, you got a list of instructions, you put it all in there, stir it, throw it in the oven, boom, there it goes. But that is not the case. And then, of course, she quotes Proverbs 22:6, says, train up a child in the way that he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. And she says, you see, that's a principle. And the reason God gave a principle there instead of a step-by-step instructions is because every child is different. You believe that? I'll tell you one thing. Our daughter Caitlin did absolutely nothing to prepare us for our son. Love you, son. But I tell you what, you could put her on the floor with a book and she'd be content for hours on end. Eli, you turn your face away from him for 5 minutes and he'll have every light in the house go off because he's sticking butter knives in light sockets. I mean, that's just the way he rolled. Every one of them's different. You have to do things different. So she starts talking about the Ecclesiastes writer. She talks about in Ecclesiastes 3, there's time for everything. There's a time for sowing. There's a time for reaping. There's a time for loving. There's time for hate. There's a time for war. Time for peace. So, just about everything you can think of. And so one of the things she's talking about, there's a time to plant and a time to keep. And what she's talking about there is the roots. The roots. Child has to have that foundation principle, those roots that will lay hold, because there's going to be droughts. There are going to be storms. And basically she's saying that the mother is to help to lay that foundation. And she gives 3 points, I think, first, it's great. First of all, love for God. Children will learn to either love God or not know God from their parents, from their mother. That's who they're going to be spending the most time with. My daddy, when I was growing up, he was kind of there sometimes. But Mom was there, it seemed like, all the time. She really was a big part of my life. And my father he was going to and from. I didn't see him that much. But she was there all the time. And the love for God, the whole essence of who we are, why we're here, as we'll study in the Ecclesiastes letter in the Sunday school hour. Fear God, keep His commandments. That's what you're here for. You're beautifully, wonderfully made. You're created in the image of God, and you need to behave as such. And the most important thing that you can do is leave this life prepared to meet God. That's what this life is all about. And that starts with the mother laying those roots. If they're not laid, it can be very tough. Those of you who were raised by a godly mother, oh, man, you should thank the Lord every day. Thank her. Appreciate her, because a lot of us were not. A lot of us had to figure that out on our own. And sometimes folks don't figure that out. As a matter of fact, if a child isn't given that proper foundation, then they can grow up to just really be not the greatest people in the world. Number 2, love of parents and one another. A child learns how they should treat their spouse, or the things that are important from watching their parents interact. Now, brethren, I know you may say, Ron, how in the world can you? I remember this quite well. My parents were divorced when I was 6 years old. And I watched, and I had stepdads and stepmoms and all that stuff. And I'm not putting that down. If you don't have the real thing, that's the next best thing. But I made a covenant with myself. And you might say, well, you'd see how long that would have lasted. Well, I don't know how long it would have lasted, but I made a covenant with myself that I was going to do it once. I was going to marry one woman, And I was going to make that work, or I was going to give up on the whole process. That was just, I did not want to put children through what I went through. Now, that's my experience. Yours may be different, and that's fine. I'm just telling you what my little old gray matter was thinking. That's why it was so important that the woman that I married would be it. And so I was pretty selective in that, and I hope that maybe you young folks, maybe you can listen to that and understand how important it is. Because if you love your wife, or your wives, you love your husband, the natural result of that is going to be children. And then it's not just you anymore. It's you and your spouse. And then it's not just you and your spouse. It's you, your spouse, and the offspring, your children. And so then the decisions that you make not only affect you, but they affect somebody else, and then many other people. No man is an island. And when you get into those type of relationships, it's very, very important to make the right decision. If you're a Christian, you need to marry a Christian. That way you have the same standard. You're following the same rule book, and you have a place to go and appeal to. So number 2 in her estimate was love of parents for one another. The ultimate love we should have is for God. The end result of that will be love for your spouse, be love for your children. It'll be treating your spouse like you should. It'll be committed to your spouse as you should, and your children, and society, your workplace, everything. It just flows so much better. Number 3, love for the child. Love for the child, and this is sometimes where it gets difficult, because your mother is not supposed to be your best friend. Now, maybe that can happen later on, but initially she's got some ground rules she needs to set up. She can't be your best friend because Barry was talking Tuesday night in the meeting. I got to hear him Tuesday. Was the greatest arsenal, word in the arsenal of parents is no. And there's going to be times when the parent says no. And, you may not like it, but that's it. And, you might try to argue your case and things of that nature, but no means no. How many times have you been told that? Well, I bet if I've been told no means no, I've been told that 10,000 times. No means no. She goes on to talk about love, giving a child responsibility and patiently watching them as they do that. Love slowly develops patience. And she says, and boy, this is a point that really stuck with me. And, a lot of times when you're preparing lessons, the person that you're stepping on the toes the most is yourself. She talked about, first, no mother can be as patient with her family as she should be when she spreads herself too thin. In other words, you got too much going on. You got too much going on. You got 3 children, all of them are boys. You got every one of them in a different team. One's playing in Whitwell at 2 o'clock. One's playing in Jasper at 2:30. And one is really gifted and is playing in South Dakota at 5. You're not going to be able to handle all that. So what needs to go? It's probably some of the sports. You're trying to get so much in. You're working a full-time job. Most of the time in this country, we're doing so much that we don't have the time to do the little things. And as was once said in the scripture, the king asked, "Where'd this guy go?" And he says, "Thy servant was busy here and there, and I looked, and he was gone." Things can just get away from us. And some of the mundane tasks, ladies, men, we'll get our dose here in a month, but ladies, some of the most mundane things like cleaning, cooking. You might say, "Oh, you're being a sexist, Ron." No, I'm talking about, if you don't clean, guess what? After a while, you can tell it when you can't get through the house for the dust. Or cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, they're vexing, but they are necessary. And they're a necessary part of a home. Don't wash clothes for a week and see what happens. Somebody's got to do it. And so, ladies, I'm not saying it's all your job, but it's an important part of your job. Now, look at it this way. A lot of times we think, well, if I'd go down to the orphanage there and I could clean for them little fellers, and little girls, I could wash their clothes, and, I give a day a week or something, and I'd take, what would we think? Why, I'm doing the Lord's work. That's right. I volunteer time at the I even became a house parent, and I take care of all them little kids. I make sure they're fed. I cook for them. I clean them up. I wash their linens. I do all. We think, boy, that's doing the Lord a service right there, isn't it? Isn't that a great thing, taking care of orphans? What about your own children? That's where it comes home to me. Oh, man, that's right. My duty as a mother, my duty as a father, it comes down to being what God would have us to be. And the domestic responsibilities, men and women, may differ. And that may differ from house to house. Some folks are more gifted at some things than are others. But that is an important part. And you're not, wimping out because you do those such things. Sister McWhorter goes on to also say there's a time to pluck up that which is planted and a time to loose and to cast away. And that's when she talks about archery. She says there's a time when you take archery as a principle. What is that? You put the arrow on the bow and you shoot it. What's that mean? You let it go. And I thought she had a great point here. It says, when the time comes for the child to embark upon a life of his own, it is a wise mother who voluntarily closes the door to her offspring's new life from the outside before her interference in adult affairs causes that door to be slammed in her face from the inside. So a time to let go. And sometimes that's hard to do, but that's a part of effective mothering. And so just some food for thought from her. And now I'm ready to get to my lesson. Y'all ready for that? Yeah. In 1914, a lady by the name of Anna Jarvis stayed after Congress to the point where they passed a day in which we'd put on the calendars Mother's Day. Now, the Bible doesn't say anything about having a Mother's Day. It doesn't say, one day a year thou shalt honor thy mother. What does it say? Honor thy mother and father. And that's an everyday occurrence. And, of course, Paul will say, honor thy father and thy mother. And he says, if you do this, then it's going to go well with you on earth because it's the first commandment with promise. In other words, when God gave the Ten Commandments, he didn't say, have no other gods before me and then give a promise with that. He gave out 4 commands on how man deals with God, then 6 commands on how man deals with man. And the first one, honor thy father and mother, he says if you do that, it's going to go well with you. Now, what does that mean? Parents do things like tell us to wash behind our ears, look both ways before we cross the road, eat those peas, even though you may not like green things. Do those things, and the Bible says as a general rule, as a proverbial rule, you're going to live longer. 4 things, very quickly, won't take long, for why we should honor mothers. First of all, their role in childbearing. Do you realize the sin in the garden is a result of why women have more pain today than they did? I don't know what exactly would have been involved, but apparently childbearing would not have been as bad as it is today had it not been for what took place in the garden. Because God said that's going to be increased, the pain that's involved with that. Do you know what the number one cause of death for women was, before the last 100 years? For 5,900 years, however long you believe the earth's been created? Childbearing. Childbearing killed more ladies than any other thing in history. It's a very dangerous thing, very complicated thing. Sometimes my wife will talk about the process, some of the things that she sees at work. She has to go to a lot of deliveries. And brethren, I tell you, it's amazing that we're even here sometimes. I think of all the things that can go wrong, from conception to, delivery, just absolutely amazing. Then your heart just goes out, to like the couple that was announced this morning. 8 months they've been anticipating this child. And already loving, I'm sure probably had names if it's going to be a girl or a boy, if they already knew things being bought. It's just a terrible thing. And then you see families, you see people who have an opportunity to have children and decide to have it medically terminated. Folks, that's just enough to make angels weep. Well, their role in childbearing. Childbearing is so painful, as a matter of fact, in Isaiah's letter, talking about the fall of Babylon. It's going to be like a woman having a baby. Jeremiah will use a woman having a baby. The King James has travail. The newer translations will say a woman bearing child. But Jeremiah 49 talks about the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be like a woman having a baby. It's going to be a very significant thing. It's going to be a painful thing. In John 16:21, our Lord and Savior says it's like a woman. The pain that they would be going through is like a woman when she has a baby, the great pain that she goes through. Yet, when the child is delivered, the great joy she has. And he talks about himself going away and coming back as a result of that. One of the great matriarchs of the Bible died giving birth to a son. Remember Rachel? Oh, man, she was the apple of Jacob's eye. Loved that woman. She was able to have Joseph, but when she gave birth to Benjamin, she died. That's a lot of pain. That's a lot of... as a matter of fact, when she was having that baby, the midwife said, "Oh, you're going to be blessed. You're going to have a son." She named him son of my affliction, son of my suffering, Ben-Omai. Of course, his daddy changed his name to Benjamin, which Ben, of course, is just the Hebrew word for son, and Jamin, the idea of my right hand, my strength. His mother said, "Son of my sorrow." The father named him son of my right hand. So she died. The greatest gift our mothers give to us is simply being here. Number two, the great thing that women do for their sons and daughters is care for them. Got a cute little illustration here. You talk about mothers that cared for their children. You remember Samson. Samson's mama, Samson saw this girl. He just said, "I got to have her. She's beautiful." But she was a Philistine. And of course, she knew what the Bible said. She knew what God said in Deuteronomy 7 about marrying foreign nations, and it just vexed his mother's heart, because mothers are on the lookout for their sons and their daughters. They want what's best for them, and they can see the potential danger of things. I thought it was interesting. It was a mother was concerned about her only son going off to college, and she wrote a letter to the college president and said, "Dear sir, my son has been accepted for admission to your school." And she says, "I'm asking you to give personal attention to this." She says, "I want you to help with his select of a roommate. I want a roommate that doesn't use foul language. He doesn't tell off-color jokes, doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, doesn't chase after girls." She said, "I hope you understand why I'm appealing to you directly. You see, this is the first time that my son will be away from home, away from me, except for those 3 years he spent in the Marine Corps." Okay. Mothers still show that great concern. And this goes throughout their entire life, and a lot of times the life of the child, if the child happens to pass for the mother. And then sometimes even after that. We'll close with this. There's a story about a king. His name was Saul. He was the first king of what we'd call the United Kingdom. He did some things that made God upset. God would eventually take the kingdom away from him and give it to a man after his own heart. His name would be David. But in the process of Saul being king, he violated an agreement made with the Gibeonites, and he killed a bunch of them. And after David was king, the land started going through a drought, started going through some hard times, and David asked the people that could do that with the ephod and so forth to find out why it was. Well, come to find out, it was because this covenant had been broken. And so David calls the Gibeonites and says, "What can we do to make this right?" And the Gibeonites said, "We don't want money, we don't want gold, but we want the offspring of Saul to pay the price for the dead, all our dead people." And so David took 5 sons from one woman and 2 sons from a lady by the name of Rizpah. They were both concubines from Saul, and those 7 boys were executed. They were executed because their daddy had broken that covenant, and God had required some type of blood payment, if you will. Well, in 2 Samuel 21, beginning with about verse 8, we find Rizpah. This is the mother of those 2 boys. She stays out on a rock where they're hanging. Their bones are hanging. Their bodies are hanging. And she stays there from April to October, about 7 months. And what does she do? All day long, she keeps critters off of those babies' bodies. Yeah, I know they're full-grown men, but for her, they were her babies. They were her babies' bodies. And she was taking care of her babies' bodies after the soul had already departed. Spirit had left the body, they were dead, but she was taking care of those. She would not leave. And David, it was brought to his attention that Rizpah has been out on this rock now for about 7 months, keeping critters and birds and things away from those boys' body. And of course, immediately, he had Saul and Jonathan's bones dug up. He had those all 7 taken down and buried in a place to rectify the situation. That's how much a mama loves you. She loves you in this life, and she'll love you in the life to come. So when we think about honoring our mothers, what a great day, but not just a day. Let's make it more than just a day. And husbands, you honor your wives. The Bible says we're to honor our wives and love them, shower them with love and affection and appreciation. But I'll tell you another thing, husbands. You're not the husband that you ought to be if your wife's a Christian, and you're not. You can't be what you need to be for your family. You need to rectify that. You need to be everything. You need to be the spiritual leader of your household. You can't take the leadership if you're not out there leading. Children, one of the ways that we honor our mothers is by doing the things that they'd want us to do. I'm not trying to put anybody on a guilt trip or anything of that nature, but bottom line is, if your mother's what she ought to be in the eyes of God, she's doing everything she can to make sure you are, trying to help you get there. She's installing those principles in you from a very early age, how to love God and how to obey God. Just like you love you, and she teaches you to love your daddy, to honor your father, your earthly father. She wants you to honor your heavenly Father as well. So perhaps you're here as a child, maybe a grown-up child, never obeyed the gospel. Your mother, whether she's here or someplace else, would love to hear that that's exactly what happened. You see, that's what she's trying to do. That's what life's all about, fearing God and keeping His commandments. So if you're here this morning, you've never obeyed the gospel, you need to do that. Maybe in times past you have, but you got away from home, got away from mama, and you just haven't kind of kept your nose to the grind like you ought. There's an opportunity to change that. Don't leave this building without being what you ought to be. If we can help you in any way, we encourage you to come.